So Spring is today over 18 years old. If you look at the commit history, it obviously won't show that because it's moved over the years. But if you look at, I believe this is the oldest author tag in Spring. It's on Bean Factory, which is one of the classes, or rather interfaces, at the core of the dependency injection container. And the @since is April 13th, 2001. So when I was thinking about speaking at this conference, this was kind of on my mind, the idea of the 18 years. And then actually in recent weeks, it really came together for me a lot because my oldest son just turned 18. As you can probably tell, I'm Australian. Legally, at the age of 18 in Australia, you can both drink and vote. So, in Australia, an 18-year-old is an adult. Spring would be able to both drink and vote in Australia. 18 years is a very, very long time. So, compared to things that are out there and very popular, and indeed growing in popularity today, Spring is quite unusual. So let's think about that code snippet that I showed you. That was not in Git. That's how old Spring is. But first, let's talk about what I'm going to cover today. Hopefully we'll have a fair bit of time towards the end for Q&A because, it'd be just nice to have open discussion. Hopefully I don't have 70 minutes of content. I'm going to talk about the birth of Spring, how, if to pursue the analogy of child rearing, how Spring as an open source community and as a framework and as a product was raised, and some of the lessons that perhaps we can draw for building lasting things. So let's go back to 2001 when I wrote that first code. That code did not go into GitHub. You'll find Spring's code base on GitHub now, but that's not where that code went. Didn't go there because GitHub didn't exist. It didn't go there because GitHub didn't exist because Git didn't exist. So Spring is, I think, 3 or 4 years older than Git. It actually went into good old CVS. We had between the CVS era on SourceForge, of all places, and the GitHub era, we had a short and, for me, frankly, fairly sorry era of Subversion. People told me I should like Subversion. I could never like Subversion. I actually didn't mind CVS that much, and I absolutely love Git. But anyway, the Subversion era wasn't happy for me. And of course, that early code had no generics. It had no annotations because this was well before Java 5. So let's think about what was happening in Java land and enterprise Java in 2001. It was really at the peak of what in my first book I call the complexity industry. The complexity industry was thriving in Java. It had taken a rather simple language, a language that was good partly because it chose not to do some of the crazy things that you could do in C++, took a language that was good and simple, and added layers and layers that made it into a hideous pretzel of complexity. So Java was really very good, but J2EE and the experience that people had building J2EE applications was really, really terrible. I mean, basically, a group of large vendors trying to sell very complex products had built very complex specs, and those specs were actually even worse and even more complex because they included large parts of the failed attempts of Corba to create a universal, remote object protocol. So, these vendors wanted you to put all your code onto an architecture like this, which it had things like portlet containers. There were layers and layers of it. And of course, these were massive monolithic products. So this was a pretty sorry era for enterprise Java. And I would say that enterprise Java was probably well on the way to extinction in 2001, and it would have been deserved. Because I remember a couple of years later, a friend who worked at a very large SI, a global SI, said that of the hundreds of projects they had on J2EE technologies in the United States at that time, not one of them could really be considered truly successful. So things were pretty bleak. In terms of the lessons to draw here, I draw one lesson from this, which is fairy tales can often offer useful lessons. Unless the fairy tale is like something like WebSphere that's sold at the golf course. If the fairy tale is not solved at the golf course, it may have value. The fairy tale I'm specifically thinking about here is The Emperor's New Clothes. Actually, my first book, I seriously considered subtitling The Emperor's New Clothes, but I thought that might be a bit much for both the publisher and the readers. So I think the lesson here is that we should question fashion. So in 2001, essentially, as a Java developer, you were never going to get any respect, you were never going to get a pay rise, you were probably never going to get a romantic partner unless you did lots of EJBs, because that's what worthy Java developers did. Anybody who didn't do EJBs, it didn't matter if their servlets worked just fine, they were not worthy of respect. So I'm not going to call out any technologies of the present, but I will suggest that's a very good question to ask. When you see a technology that you have to use because everybody uses it and everybody knows that's the thing that you need to use, it is always good to ask, does this really make my life simpler? What happens if, are there alternatives? So, I think that lesson, the fundamental fact that Spring and the Spring community initially showed great disrespect to something that was incredibly fashionable and incredibly complex, that's a useful lesson. Okay, so let's go forward into the genesis of Spring. I'm just curious, how many people owned a book that looked like this? Oh, you can't put your hand up, Jürgen. You co-authored the other book that looked like this. You don't count. So, yes, there were two books. The first one, Expert One-on-One J2EE Design and Development, that really floats off the tongue. That came out in late 2002. The second one in 2004, co-authored with Jürgen, but the publisher, in their infinite wisdom, decided to use the same cover because they realised, obviously, that this pose was so iconic. Why was it, actually, a brief story about that photograph. It was taken, I was living in London at the time in a fairly small house, and it was taken on our dining table. We had a lounge dining, it wasn't terribly big. The professional photographers that the publisher wanted to use came in with so much equipment that it practically filled our little living room, and pretty much the only place left for me was to actually be sitting on the dining table. And they chose the pose. So it was the photographer in London who chose that. So why were the books important? The books were one of the reasons that Spring, I think, is unusual, because they established a shared set of values. So, there are not many open source projects that set out already with essentially a manifesto behind them. And that proved to be really, really important. Your shared values, really, to accomplish anything significant in a project, need to be somewhat controversial. Why? Why? Because, if your shared values are that you like kittens, or you like apple pie, or you think motherhood is good, that really isn't distinguishing anything about your effort from the world at large. So there were shared values that people came together in with Spring around the books that were controversial. And because of that, they enabled Spring to do something that nobody else was doing. What were some of those values? One of those values was my ideas on naming. And not everyone agrees, still not everyone agrees. However, one thing that I think has been really important as Spring has grown is you've got a pretty good chance, if you know what something does, you've got a pretty good chance of guessing the name of the Spring class or interface for it. And that's actually pretty great. It really makes it easier to understand the code base. And also remember, this is not stuff that you need to mess with yourself. You are never going to extend abstract singleton proxy factory bean in your own code. If you do, don't rethink, because that's not what you're meant to be doing. So that was an example of a relatively trivial thing that was controversial, but proved important. Another much more important thing was the idea about checked exceptions. This one is really interesting. Like, Spring in the early years was quite controversial. There, was a lot of criticism of Spring. The one thing that I have quite literally gotten hate mail about was advocating the use of unchecked exceptions. Like, these days, it's almost a given. JDBC itself changed. But back then, there was a belief that in Java, somehow you could ensure correctness by writing an infinite number of catch blocks. And also that this would ensure correction. Nobody would ever just catch and follow the exception. Oh no, they'd never do that. They would painstakingly write out a catch block for every single type of exception. So this was another example of a controversial idea that was established actually before Spring and in conjunction with Spring, and enabled Spring to do something different. So for example, that enabled Spring JDBC to slash the amount of code you needed to do database access by probably about 70%. It also ensured that exceptions didn't get swallowed, and that actually it was far more robust, and people stopped experiencing things like connection leaks. So the biggest controversial idea, however, in Spring was the thing I think that really has underpinned Spring's success ever since. That is the idea that it's vitally important to separate your business logic and your own code from infrastructure concerns. For example, before Spring, when you wrote an EJB in the era of EJB2, you had to implement your EJB home interface, your remote interface, or had to write your home interface and your remote interface, and you had to write a bean implementation class. All of those things were completely tied to the EJB API. Even better, because that wasn't enough, they were tied to JNDI. So they would normally go and look up other EJBs and all the other marvelous things that the app server did for you. They would look that up using the API. This made them very difficult to test, and also meant that that code couldn't even run in a servlet container. It could only run in a J2EE app server. So with Spring, one of the big ideas was that your code really can be separated from the infrastructure. And of course, this is where we get to dependency injection and the Hollywood principle, don't call me, I'll call you, and which we extended with AOP and injecting behaviors like transaction management, Spring security, injecting behaviors like security checks. This was a really, really important idea. And this is why we're here in 2018. Because it turned out that in 2003, this enabled you to be far more productive in writing your J2EE apps. It enabled you to be able to actually unit test them, which was previously impossible. And it today enables you to write code that you can still unit test, but is separated from Kubernetes or AWS or PCF or wherever it runs. So that, has been very core to the success of Spring. One of the things that led to that is I'd started reading quite a lot about TDD and Agile and XP and all those kind of things back in probably 2001, and I remember thinking, oh, this is terribly naive. You just can't unit test J2EE applications, so how can you have this methodology that calls for unit testing? And then I thought, maybe that's the wrong way around. If there's a technology that makes unit testing impossible, maybe the problem isn't unit testing. So hand in hand with values, which are how you do things, vision is where to. And it's very important to have a vision as well. Spring actually had an unusually big vision. So the vision was essentially to radically simplify enterprise Java, but it was also to innovate in open source, right? We were not commoditizing things that already existed. What we were doing was innovating and creating something that didn't exist, but happening to do it in open source. This meant fighting more battles than the typical open source project fought. So for example, Spring, I think, was in the Java space, to my knowledge, unique in standing up to the large vendors and saying, no, we don't think your specifications are the solution to everything. In fact, we think some of them are absolutely worthless. Obviously, we tried to say that more tactfully, but it was a different position from, say, what the Hibernate team took. So the Hibernate team's position was that, essentially, at the end of the day, influence over the Java EE, as they were then, specs, was probably more important than actually making Hibernate better or really moving forward new features for their community. So whereas Spring was very different, we really wanted to be able to innovate, we really didn't want to be constrained. Spring also, in terms of vision, played an important role in the history and evolution of open source. So you may recall the slogan that Mark Fleury of JBoss came up with, professional open source, which was a really interesting and important concept. So what we aspired to do was to take that essentially to the next level of maturity. And most of the committers of Spring have always been employed by the same entity. It started off being Interface 21, then it was Spring Source, then it was VMware, then it was Pivotal. It's probably going to be VMware again. But this model has actually worked very well because it's liberally licensed. It means that a lot of very talented people can spend all their time working on Spring, and it doesn't exclude community contributions. So, I think it's pretty interesting looking at what happens in terms of that open source business model moving ahead with respect to, SaaS and the role of players like Amazon. But I think for that era of business model, Spring played a really interesting part. You can have values and vision, but really what gets you there is people. To go back to the analogy around child rearing, we're all familiar with the term, it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to produce a successful and popular piece of software. And there was a mixture of good fortune, I think, and good management in getting the right people on board. And like the biggest single piece of good fortune, and I think this point in time, it was so early it was good fortune, was Jürgen Hurler becoming involved in the project. Jürgen is sitting right over there, so I'm going to have to be nice though. I've got a slide in a moment that I particularly put in to troll him, so... Jürgen, it's fortunate he's there because you can actually see that he's not in fact green. Pivotal have turned him green on this photo. Jürgen got involved through the forums that were set up by Rox Press. So the first book was published by Rox. They set up forums to discuss the book. I'd published 30,000 lines of code with the book. I was surprised to discover that most of the questions were about, can I use this code? Because I hadn't bothered to specify a license. I thought it would be, just used for people to look at. So Jürgen was one of the people who was very involved in technical discussions, and I must admit, I was losing faith at one point because we had a lot of discussions and Jürgen hadn't committed anything. I'd given him commit rights. And I thought, oh, you're all talk. Your comments are great, but maybe you don't deliver code. And then, of course, Jürgen made a wave of awesome commits that like changed and improved some core things in the container that were very tricky to do. And he hasn't really stopped. That was early 2003, and he hasn't really stopped making awesome commits ever since. So, you know, having someone of Jürgen's level of dedication, ability, and caring was obviously incredibly important. But here it's interesting to note a unique thing about Spring. Well, I don't know if it's unique, but it's very unusual. I didn't realize how unusual this was until I got involved in other pieces of open source. With Spring, the people who use Spring have the same skill set as the people who write it. That's very unusual. Like, most people who use Linux are not C programmers. A good proportion of the people who use Kubernetes are not Go programmers. It is not usual, but it is a tremendous advantage because it means that people can transition from using the software to contributing to the software and like even transition back the other way very smoothly. What this means is you get people who come from application development, understand the pain, and therefore in their work on the framework, you know, really make things that are highly relevant to end users. So Jürgen was at the time working for an Austrian company that was building a commercial product. He started using Spring. The company realized that even pre 1.0, the value of Spring, you know, to their productivity was so great, they actually started paying for some of his time to work on Spring. And of course, eventually he moved over completely. This is true if you look at many of the core teams. So for example, Dave Sire. Dave Sire worked for Fitch Ratings in London. He was an architect. He was working on various, you know, commercial products that were built using Spring. So it meant that, you know, when the time and opportunity came over to work on Spring more intensely, there was zero ramp time. There was already great familiarity with the source code, a lot of passion for seeing how useful it was in production. I'm going to say a little bit more about Jürgen at this point. Oh, I'm not sure if this is the right Jürgen. This is the German Jürgen. The German Jürgen is, I think, a rather shonky motivational speaker. This is the Jürgen we want when he's not green, although he's against a green background. And, you know, Jürgen's contribution to Spring is memorialized in the fact that he's one of the very few humans to have a verb named after him, to Jürgenize. To Jürgenize means to make it the way you should have hopefully had it in the first place if you'd been as good as Jürgen. And there can be frustrations about this process. Like if you put in a pull request, it will probably end up being pretty different by the time it hits master. But it's been incredibly valuable for Spring. So thank you, Jürgen, for 15, 16 years of Jürgenization. So one of the key lessons here is that quality beats quantity in a team. The Spring team has always been really small. Certainly the Spring framework team has been incredibly small, even if you count all the really popular projects. It's a small number of very talented people. I actually used to feel embarrassed about this. When SpringSource was a very small company and we were trying to sell support and other things to very large companies, they'd always ask us, how many engineers do you have? And I believe I've never actually told a lie in my career, so I didn't lie, but we'd always try to avoid the subject. And I felt bad about that until I later discovered that the BEA WebLogic team was really small. And BEA was the only good application server. Of a class of products that were, broadly speaking, a disaster, at least it was a good one. The BEA WebLogic team was really small, and also I later learned the Oracle database team, like the core database team, is astonishingly small, and sits at the heart of everything that Oracle have done over the years. So, it's very important to grow a team carefully. Better to grow a team slowly out of great people than, potentially dilute the quality. So the village is a great model for the core contributors to a piece of software. But the village is not enough. If you want to create something that's as important or as robust as Spring, you need to have a large community and user base. In the open source world, there is a fascinating difference between the community and the notion of users in commercial software. In commercial software, the users can't see inside. So for example, it's much more difficult for the users to transition from using the software to contributing to it. Secondly, they probably don't want to, right? Because there's this different transaction where money changes hands to have the right to use it. In open source, you don't have either of those things. So people can contribute, they obviously don't have to pay to use the software, and you really need as large a community as possible to get good quality open source, because it guarantees that the edge cases are covered, things that no one would ever think of get flushed out remarkably rapidly when you've got hundreds of thousands or indeed millions of users. So you want a village of people who are directly working on the product, but you want cities of people who are actually using the product and engage with it and care about it. So one lesson from that, which I think is just as relevant internally in a company as externally, is you need to have marketing. So you need to have marketing around open source, and you need to have marketing around your technology even inside a traditional company. Lots of good initiatives in companies fail because people don't, market them vigorously. If you have a piece of technology that you think's really important, don't forget to market it, because it's not going to achieve its full potential without marketing. And this, of course, is somewhere where in the early years of Spring, we started to specialize a little bit. So, gradually, as Jürgen took over leadership of the coding from me, I spent many, many hours fighting, literally battles, around Spring that were very important to establishing the place in which it became. One other thing to say here about scaling up is the power of modeling is very, very great. So, one thing that we were always very clear about is we behave respectfully towards each other and towards the community in the Spring team. And as a result, that scaled up. It scaled up in those days we probably didn't even have a code of conduct. It scaled up not so much because we said don't do these bad things. It scaled up because the core contributors to Spring behaved in a respectful and inclusive manner, and that meant that you, for example, if they patiently answered community questions in the forums, we had our own forums back then, the next wave of community contributors would be grateful for that, and they would answer somebody else's question before a core committer needed to jump in. So that power of modeling and actually behaving well scales really, really well. And I think that's one thing that, I'm very proud of with Spring, that I think we've always had a respectful community, and we've really, almost never needed to eject anyone from the community for behaving badly, because people were attracted to the community partly because people behaved respectfully. This actually brings us to the interface between your community. Let's suppose at this point you've created something great, you've got a good village of people working on it, you've marketed it well. Sadly, there are still people in the world who don't use your thing. This is really sad. I guess one of the things for those of you who know me is I'm a little bit of a megalomaniac. I'm the same way that Henry Ford believed that everyone should own a Ford. I kind of believed and still believe that every Java developer should use Spring, and that Spring is not truly successful until that's the case. But the fact is, there will always be people who don't use your thing. Maybe they're not Java developers. So for example, maybe they're Ruby developers. And those people can have good ideas. And it's a very good practice to actively look around at ideas that people are generating, and without too much pride of ownership, without not invented here, be willing to take them on board. And I think the history of Spring is the history of taking other people's ideas on board. But one of the interesting things that I think we did is we always acknowledged them. We did not steal ideas, we openly acknowledged where we got good ideas. So an example of that is Pico Container. Pico Container was a rival DI container. It was a very civil rivalry. It was mainly ThoughtWorks people in the UK, and I used to go and have beers at the ThoughtWorks office. We had somewhat different views on how to do DI, but it was all very friendly. And they had the idea of constructor injection. Back then, Spring was around setter injection. There were issues with constructor injection pre-annotations. It wasn't yet ready to be a general solution, but clearly this was an idea that was valuable. So we just implemented it in Spring and made no secret of the fact that we'd adopted an idea from someone else. Of course, now you roll the clock forward, constructor injection with modern Java is clearly the way to go in almost all cases. Another example was Rails. Rails, interestingly, proved not to have the longevity of Spring, despite the fact that it's younger. The reason for that is its idea wasn't as big. Its idea was, have we got a good way of taking a relational database app and exposing it to the web, broadly speaking. Whereas Spring's idea of, what's the simplest way we can make people able to implement applications in Java was bigger. However, Rails had one really, really good idea, and that was convention over configuration. This idea that, what if you didn't try to do everything differently every single time? What if you just accepted that there's a sensible set of defaults that we can use and just roll with that? That was something that we looked at back in probably 2005, 2006 with Spring, and took a number of years to get right. Eventually, Spring Boot successfully, captured that learning and put it successfully into Java. And interestingly, one of the reasons that we failed earlier in taking on board the ideas of Rails were the Java community I don't think was ready. So our first effort to do this was Spring Roo, which some of you may remember. The reasons for its failure were partly technical. There was a lot of reliance on code generation and the web tier was never quite right. But I think much bigger than that, the Java community was not ready. Back in 2008 through 2010, there just wasn't a willingness to accept something that limited choice because people felt infinite choice was really, really important. So, to some degree, people had become free of the kind of EJB complexity industry, but they were still carrying some of that baggage in their own head. I think one of the things that really changed that was the move towards a greater number of services. The move towards cattle from pets really changed that because suddenly it's kind of a bit hard to muster the energy to create a new service every couple of days and make this one weird and different from the last one. That requires more energy than people typically have. So at that point, it's pretty easy to just follow the Spring Boot conventions. I've talked about a bunch of the things that worked for Spring. We also should talk about the things that didn't work. I guess one thing was Roo, good concept of what we were trying to do, didn't really work out. There were a couple of other things that didn't work out, and they reflect the interesting balance of the relationship with the community. So I said that Spring was about innovation in open source. Like, there's part of Spring's DNA that's like Apple. It's like nobody asked for an iPhone. Nobody asked for a DI container with AOP and portable service abstractions. Literally no one asked for that. And so there was always this thing where sometimes Spring produced ideas, obviously based on the work of others, but produced ideas that were kind of ahead of the curve and that the community took a while to adopt and did adopt. But there were also times when we got it wrong and when we went too far down a technical rat hole. It's very easy to fall in love with the technology and like just pursue that too far. Two examples of that were what we did with OSGI and what we did with AOP. OSGI was something that it's the modularity, a modularity approach in Java. It solved some problems that were problems of a very, very small number of users. And it created other problems that would have affected all users. So essentially, we got too seduced down the OSGI path to the point where we started to realize that some of the core Spring values of simplicity were likely to be lost by excessive use of OSGI. So we pulled back a lot from that. AOP was an interesting one in that, eventually Spring kind of parted ways with OSGI. AOP remains core to Spring and has been an incredibly valuable part of how Spring delivers what it does. However, we probably got a little bit too AOP happy, and we started to kind of begin to force our users to understand things like the AspectJ point cut syntax, which most users, point cut language syntax, which most users did not want to do. So it turned out that AOP was incredibly important in terms of enabling things like declarative transaction management and Spring security, but wasn't something that should be exposed to users in a maximum dose. So, of course, there were other mistakes, but these are two that, really, really stand out to me. Another thing is actually, I think we possibly could have been a bit more radical more quickly in terms of moving off J2EE, in terms of, actually enabling the decoupling from that runtime earlier. Something that was definitely not a mistake, however, was our approach to governance. So in the early years of Spring, well, not the very early years, once vendors like BEA and IBM and Oracle realized that Spring wasn't going to go away, their natural response was to try to embrace Spring and get it to Apache or somewhere where it would slowly die. Well, that's a little flippant, but we got considerable pressure to either set up a Spring Foundation or go to Apache or Eclipse. And after very, very serious deliberation, we concluded that Spring, the model was not broken and that it was working, and it was the best way to ensure that Spring progressed rapidly and delivered great results for Spring users. And I think that was a very good call. I think if you look at the fact that Spring is unusual in the terms of its ability to innovate in open source, I think being outside an existing foundation was actually very, very important. In terms of the pre-history of Spring, just going back to the 2001 to 2003 era, one of the inputs that I had into Spring was, having done a lot of consulting for different companies, I'd actually seen lots of in-house J2EE frameworks. Everyone had one, literally. It was so hard to write this stuff that you had to do your best to try to simplify it a bit. The only problem was that most of these frameworks actually made it worse. I remember, I was never an EJB fan, but I can remember in mid-2003 trying to write some code for a customer in London and thinking, oh, I just want to write a session bean. It's not that bad compared to this monstrosity that you're inflicting on me as a developer with your in-house framework. That led to one of the core ideas of Spring, which is that you make the right thing easy to do. You don't make things you don't want people to do impossible. Because as soon as you, as a framework designer or an architect, deliberately make certain things impossible, you're effectively forcing some developer who has a genuine need to do that thing to either work around or abandon your framework. So, these frameworks that used to proliferate in the enterprise that were totally based on locking things down and making it impossible for developers to make individual choices never succeeded. I have never seen one that actually added any value at all. Usually quite the reverse. So there's an important lesson here that I think Spring is informed by itself, which is the developers you want to employ need autonomy. They need to be treated with respect. They need to have some autonomy, freedom of action. And anything that's based around trying to prevent them doing things isn't going to work. However, you can provide incentives, and you absolutely should provide incentives to make the right thing easy to do. This is a really complex issue because you do find that developers often do want to do things that maybe aren't necessary or maybe are a little too fancy. So there's a balancing act there. So I would set against it the slightly contradictory lesson 8, which is question the enterprise mindset. When we look at how Java has established itself as being highly productive today and highly competitive in microservices, a lot of that has occurred because of abandoning the kind of enterprise mindset. So, back in the days when Rails was seriously challenging Java for certain types of applications, the Rails people had a kind of mindset of almost throwaway applications, whereas Java people believed that every single thing should be, architected through multiple layers, and there was a lot of overkill. That mindset is clearly not appropriate to a world of microservices, and it's very fortunate that Java developers have largely thrown it off. Because this is another area where you get the emperor's new clothes, right? Where you get this obsession with complexity that doesn't potentially lead to that much value. I said that if Spring was Australian Spring would be able to drink, which leads to the question, what stories would Spring tell over a beer? Well, maybe there'll be actual beer later, which might help, but I can tell a few of them now. The first one is a story around naming, and you won't be able to read this, so I'll read some of it. The red banner is from the ROX Programmer to Programmer forums, which ROX Press set up for my book. And a guy called Jan Karoff, who's from Luxembourg, was one of the most active people discussing early on. There was Jan and Jürgen and myself were the most active people on the forums. And when we came to the question of open sourcing it, obviously we needed a name. And Jan was the person who came up with the name Spring. Unfortunately, Google will not find me the original post where he suggested that name, so this is Jürgen and my reaction to it. And Jürgen wrote, I quite like the name Spring too. Simple, easy to spell, positive associations. The domain could be www.springframework.org, which would be more distinctive. I'm neither fond of names that are hard to spell, nor of harmony, which is another suggestion, which I consider too heartwarming. See, great coder, but apparently doesn't like kittens. A simple Nepali name would be nice. I think I may have suggested that. The framework is very simple indeed, although somewhat clumsy. Yes, I think the framework, it just seemed a little bit too arrogant to call it the framework. So anyway, we went forward with Spring Framework, and Yarn had at that point played a very important role in the history of Spring, but moved on. Open source development can be, particularly if you have a different day job, can be very, very time consuming and demanding. So Yarn, with great regret, made a decision to spend more time playing bass in a band and actually talking to his girlfriend in the evening rather than getting his laptop out every night. So yeah, we're very thankful for the contribution he made, even though it was fairly brief. Another thing that happened early in those days was the public discussions and indeed battles in the server side, which look like this. This is from Wayback Machine. It's hard to believe it today when the server side is not really is a shadow of itself, but the server side was where it was at. In 2003 to probably 2006, you could go to the server side and you could hear vigorous debates between people like me, Cameron Purdy of Tengasol and later Oracle, Mike Cannon-Brooks of Atlassian, Bill Burke of JBoss, Mark Fleury of JBoss, various people from IBM and BA. It really was a remarkable time when there were a lot of people who were doing very, very important stuff that was really changing the course of Java that were all discussing in public. And, a lot of it was somewhat painful. There were a few genuine trolls, but there was also a lot of meaningful discussion. And I spent hours every night as part of Remember the Importance of Marketing. There was also the astroturfing incident, which I'm not going to go into, where one company actually deliberately created kind of sock puppet accounts. Was not one of the brighter spots of the server side, but it was one good or bad, it was all happening there in that era. A third story, a couple of beers in, would be the game between the blue team on the left of IBM and for the green team, Jürgen. And this game was called We Bet We Can Put the Transaction Manager Interface Where Nobody Can Find It. Because in the J2EE specs at the time, the JTA Transaction Manager interface had this weird status. It was standardized, but it didn't say where it was. Like every other vendor had kind of assumed there was a sensible place for it. But with every version of WebSphere, they decided to change it. And they could not defeat the green team because Jürgen would actually find it and ensure that for Spring users it was totally backward compatible and that they would never even notice that it had moved. So hopefully I'll get to meet some of you for actual beer and storytelling at some point, but those are some of the things that come to mind. In terms of things I personally would say about Spring today, I'm thrilled with how Spring has developed. I probably haven't contributed any code that's gone directly into Spring for something like 12 years, but I think it's amazing how the team have taken it forward and successive waves of excellent people have come in and continued to innovate. Some of my opinions, for what they're worth, about using Spring today is obviously use Spring Boot. I think that for most applications is a no-brainer. And secondly, remember what I said about convention over configuration and getting over that enterprise Java mindset. Don't fight the Spring way. A lot of people, are negative about what they consider the magic of Spring, it being too magical. I'll tell you some things about Spring magic. Firstly, it often really is magic compared to doing it without Spring. Secondly, the magic is really tested. I don't know if they emphasized unit tests in the Harry Potter universe, but in Spring there's a lot of emphasis on testing at different layers. So that magic is probably pretty solid. The magic is also usually well documented, and the magic is known to Stack Overflow. So the chances are pretty good that if you have any issue, you'll actually find an answer really, really quickly. And of course, if you find a genuine issue and raise an issue in the appropriate issue tracker, you're very likely to find the team being responsive. So I would say that if you're using Spring, your first instinct should be try to do it the way Spring's encouraging you to do it, because there's probably a reason for that, and only depart from that if you find for whatever reason it truly doesn't meet your needs. Personally, if I was writing a Spring app today, I would seriously consider Kotlin. The reason being that I think in terms of some of those core values of Spring, like simplification, Kotlin does for the JVM what Spring did to J2EE. So, I mean, Java is a fine language, and I think it's deservedly popular. I'm never going to be one of the people who, gratuitously criticize Java. But the fact is there are certain areas where it's fallen behind. Like it doesn't have multi-line interpolated strings. You get to duplicate a lot of things in constructors and members that you don't in more modern languages. And some of those things are annoying, and broadly speaking, most of them are fixed in Kotlin. So, the Spring Framework team have put a lot of effort into having excellent support for Kotlin, and I would seriously, if you can, take advantage of that and make your code simpler. One final thing I would say about Spring usage is that you absolutely should look to Spring as an example of good code standards. Like, I think consistently it's been shown by third-party tools to be one of the best products out there in terms of code quality. So you can definitely learn by looking at the implementation of Spring, but don't copy many things about the style in business applications. They really are different. If you're writing a framework that will have hundreds of thousands or millions of users versus writing a business app, it's different. So like in Spring, every single thing is, has extension points in it, because no matter how much you might think as a framework developer that you've thought of all the possible cases up front, somebody has a legitimate requirement you didn't think of, and you have to figure out how to open that up. Guess what? In your business application, that is probably not going to happen. And if it does, you can go back and refactor because you don't have 2 million people using it. So you don't need to apply, quite the same level of abstraction and generalization that you see in a framework. Which is another reason, for example, abstract singleton transaction factory proxy ban, you actually don't need something that's that complex in your own implementation, because there's a lot more levels of abstraction than you're likely to need. So that is definitely something that I myself learned the hard way writing, a hobby project that was just like essentially similar to a business app, and realizing that I just massively over-engineered it because I was, applying exactly the same kind of coding style that I would have in Spring. Don't do that. Look at the code, admire the code, but remember that this is for a different purpose. I am myself no longer writing Spring applications. If I was working on the JVM, I certainly would be using Spring. But what I'm doing is trying to take some of the lessons of Spring to something else. So, please come by the booth at Atomist and you'll see some of the things we're doing. What we're trying to do is a framework for development and delivery. Have a look at the software-defined delivery manifesto. It's the idea that a lot of things like delivery flows and working with code in many repositories should be expressed in code rather than, for example, in YAML or in Bash. That you should use a real programming language and a real framework to enable some of these things. The reason that I don't use Spring is that this is written in TypeScript. TypeScript, by the way, I think is an absolutely fantastic language. Personally, I think if you're doing anything in Node or anything using the JavaScript runtime, TypeScript is a no-brainer. Particularly if you come from a Java background, it's relatively easy to pick up and very elegant. So what we're trying to do is in TypeScript write what I like to call the API for software. So you can define your delivery flows in code and you can understand and manage your microservices at scale. So an example, which you probably can't read at the back, of delivery rules in code is we have a different approach to orchestrating delivery. Instead of having one pipeline, probably in YAML per repository, we enable you to use a framework which says that you can specify rules that will apply across all your repositories. So for example, specify rules for Spring repos, Maven repos, Node repos, and apply behaviors consistently. Similarly, we use that framework to enable you to understand what's inside your repositories. So I would strongly encourage you to go to atomist.com and come to our booth and see the kind of things that we do. And also you may well, if you're Spring users, you will probably be interested in how we do it in terms of a framework. So for example, this is looking at what we call drift across many repositories. So across 76, well actually more than 76 repositories, you can see this is at the top the Node Docker base image. We have 84 repositories using it, and we've got quite a lot of different versions. So Atomist can help you track what you have and also help you converge on your desired version. All of that tracking and conversion is enabled using a TypeScript framework, which is somewhat inspired by experience with Spring. So finally, I would say that, what started off as a little bit of a conceit, this idea of, what does it mean around 18 years, the analogy of, raising a software project like raising a child, I think it actually stands up quite well. And many of the things are relevant and valid. Start with clear values, that's very important. Be nurturing along the way and respectful, and don't use sticks. Prefer the carrot to the stick. And remember that these things grow up and become much bigger than their original parents. And in the case of Spring, obviously this is something that now belongs to an enormous community who have been very instrumental in its success. So I didn't want to talk for too long. I've intentionally given us at least 10 minutes for Q&A. Please don't forget to come visit the Atomist booth. We're at the back and at the far right. I will be there tomorrow, so hope to see you there. Thank you.